last week. So last week we were looking at classifications of financial markets and we had to stop midway. We have three further classifications to look at. So we've stopped under this topic based on trading procedures. We looked into 4 types of classifications. So today we will go through trading procedures, timing of delivery, and origin of markets. So I hope you remember what we did last week. So let me have a quick run through of it. So we started off with the most conventional method of classifying and we are moving to the more contemporary method of classifying. So conventionally being more older bases that we were used, and now we are going towards more newer methods, that newer bases that we can use to classify. So the most fundamental or the basic level of classifications that we looked at was the degree of formality. So there we looked at formal and informal markets, and we clearly differentiated between these 2 markets with examples as well. So please remember the examples in your mind whenever you hear the term, so you can easily classify. So today we have a new tool, so I'll be using that. It's easier for me to write on. So formal markets and informal, that being the keyword, or you can even use organized and unorganized to keep in mind. For formal, we use the banking system as the example. Informal, we use the informal money lenders as our example when we are comparing. And then we moved into the maturity or the time period. So here, what are we looking at? We are looking at the maturity of the financial instruments that are traded in this particular market. Remember that maturity of the financial instrument is what we are looking at. And remember, when we say maturity, we are referring to the natural lapsing of the investment, not about you selling the investment. We are looking at the natural lapse. If you invest in an instrument, when will that instrument pay you back the money you invest? That's what we are looking at, not your sell down. So many students confuse that. Here we are looking at maturity. So that is the natural end of the instrument, natural expiry of that instrument. So if this instrument expires with a time period of less than or equal to 12 months. Remember here, 12 months or less, then we refer it to as the money market. Whereas if an instrument has an expiry which is longer than 12 months, that instrument falls into the capital market category. So essentially, here is more than 1 year. So essentially, capital market refers to the long-term securities. Money market refers to the short-term securities. Remember, we understood capital market can be further divided into primary and secondary. I explained it to you why it has a secondary market. Because these are long-term securities, the natural expiry of the instrument will take at least 2 to 3 years or maybe 5 years. It could even go up to 30 when it comes to bonds. Equity, there is no particular expiry until the business winds down or the company itself does a share repurchase. Okay, so it's very long term. So for the investor to have liquidity in the market, you need to have a secondary market which supports that investor to sell down whenever he needs any liquidity, when he has any liquidity needs. So that's why there is always a secondary market to support the capital market. Money market instruments, very rarely you come across a secondary market need because the instruments are shorter tenor. But remember, treasury bills, they do have a secondary market. There are certain other instruments as well, but very limited money market instruments have a secondary market. So remember that. Then we looked at issuer versus trader. whether in the financial market, the counterparty who you trade with is the issuer of that instrument, or whether it's another investor, or whether it's a trader that we are entering into the transaction with. So if it's the issuance, the first time issuance of that security, it falls into primary market. Remember the key term being new issuance of security. Okay. Now this will encompass two ideal scenarios. One is, think about a company that has never come to the market to raise funds. This is the first time coming into the market and first time issuing the security. So what are we referring to? A IPO scenario, initial public offering. Very first time they are coming to the capital market or the share market, and the very first time they're issuing shares. Okay. And another scenario is, they are not new to the market, they are already there in the market, but if they are issuing a security for the very first time or issuing a new issuance, okay, they have already been listed in the market, they've issued shares, correct? But if they are issuing debentures, this is the first time they're issuing debentures, or they are issuing shares, but now this issuance is the new shares that are being issued, not any older ones. That's also a new issuance. So any issuance of the security that comes from the issuing entity falls into the primary market. Secondary market is previously issued securities are now being traded. In a secondary market, the key term is trading. So it occurs between the investors in a secondary market. Sorry. But in the primary market, your basic counterparties are issuer and the initial investor. Remember how the fund movement works? In the secondary market, because it's between the two investors, the fund flow doesn't affect the company. But in a primary market, because the issuance come from the issuing entity, the fund flow goes towards the entity as well. Then we had markets based on the financial instruments traded and the nature of claim made. So based on the nature of claim made, we had two types of claims, equity claim and the credit claim. So if we are referring to an equity claim, we were talking about the equity market. If we are talking about a credit claim, we are referring to the debt market. So here also we have the classifications. This is pretty much easy for you. Think about your examples here. Equity market, we are referring to shares. Debt market, we are referring to debt instruments such as debentures. So basically the difference between an equity and a debt instrument, if you can remember, you can easily classify these two segments. Okay. And then based on the financial instruments, we saw several types, because based on the type of the instrument itself, you can classify the market. Share market, the debenture market, forex market, T-bill, T-bond. Basically, it depends on the financial instrument type. Okay. Then we ended our lecture last week with talking about this financial market based on the trading procedure. Here, what are we looking at? The way you're engaging in your trade. If it's a decentralized market where you could trade directly with the other party, we are referring to a over-the-counter market. Think about, remember the example I used for you? Think about you approaching a branch. Over the counter, you meet a branch representative. So it's a personalized service for you. That's where you meet them, and there is no one place for you to go and meet them. What I mean about one place is, doesn't mean you only have to go to one particular branch and get it done. There is so many locations, any bank, any branch, you're allowed to approach and get your service. Exchange traded market, we are looking at a centralized location. If you have to get it done, you have to approach this particular location only. Only through that your trade can happen. And always remember, here there is no any customization. It is a uniform and a standard method of trading. There is always an exchange being the counterparty. Nothing is customized as per anyone's need. There is a protocol on how to trade. Everyone must adhere to that. Okay. We will now look at the in detail differences between these two markets. Okay, no. So over the counter market, the key term, remember the key term that we will first start using when we are going to explain this is decentralized market, where you get to have direct contract between the counterparties. But in an exchange traded market, we talk about a central marketplace, and the trading happens based on a defined rule and regulation. There are accepted norms in the market, and only based on that we will trade. Now, this particular difference gets linked to the last point here as well. So when I come there, I'll explain it. The second one is, over the counter market, you have very less public information about the trade that happens. You only know a indicative price. Now think about the gold market. You know, average gold market, gold price is this. Okay. But different shops can have different rates. Okay, you don't know how much that shop sold, what the quantity they sold, the price they sold. You don't know those. You don't know the details of the trade, but you know an indicative price. Today's gold price is average of this amount. So any shop you know that it'll average or be in the range close to this indicative rate. That's all you know. Okay. But in an exchange traded market, that particular market always gives out the updated information about each trade. You know the quantity that gets traded, you know the price at which it was traded. All those deals for each and every trade that happened, you have access to. The market participants can access that information. Okay. Now I'll show it you with the example so you can clearly understand. Okay. The other one is counterparty risk is relatively high. Now remember, it's a direct contract. Okay. If it's a direct contract, now there is no any middleman in that. Okay. Either of the two can cancel the agreement at any time or default on that agreement at any time. There is no one to ensure that the either party doesn't cancel or default. Of course, if a default or cancellation happens, there is a penalty. That's another totally different matter. But what I'm explaining it to you is there is a chance of counterparty not acting as agreed. That's what you call counterparty risk. Now think about this scenario. You enter into agreement to buy a land. Okay. And the other party is agreeing to sell it. The counterparty risk for the buyer is, on the day you want to buy, the seller says, sorry, I'm not selling. Okay. Or the day, for the seller, the counterparty risk is, on the day he's trying to sell, the buyer is coming and saying, sorry, I don't want to buy. Okay, so counterparty risk arises in that form. But in an exchange traded market, remember there is always an exchange acting as the middleman. Okay, because of that, there is very low counterparty risk when it comes to exchange markets. I'll explain to you how they manage that counterparty risk in a share market scenario. All right. The final difference is, in an over-the-counter market, you can always get your customized contract, and that will keep changing from one customer to another. Again, just for this, on a basic example level, I'm using gold. Gold purchased by one customer can be different from another customer, and that, depending on your requirement, the contract can be customized. But in an exchange traded market, no. There is a set of tenor available, price available, or the volume available. Only according to those guidelines you can trade. So here the contracts are standardized. Even if I go and buy, or even if you go and buy, the rules are the same, or the framework remains intact. All right. Now we will use two of our examples to see whether we could actually see these differences in the practical market. Okay. Now for the over-the-counter market, what was the example we used? We used the foreign exchange market. For the exchange traded market, we are using a share market. All right. Now over-the-counter market, we are referring to the forex. Think about you going to a branch and one of you might need 200 pounds to pay for a subscription for a overseas degree or overseas qualification. Okay. Person next to you is a businessman. He wants to convert his export proceeds of $1 million. Now you need, let's say, $200 only. The person next to you needs $1 million. Okay. So there, both of you can approach any bank. Ideally, you will have one particular bank that you need to go and get. You could either approach your bank. That also, your bank might have so many branches. You can practically approach any branch of any bank to convert. Now for the exporter, depends on his trade, where his trading relationship is. He might have to approach that particular bank, but that can be done from any branch. There is no one place for you to get it done. Share market, can he go to, are there any share market in Sri Lanka? No, there is only one, Colombo Stock Exchange. So any buying, any selling, if it's share related, you have to do it through our Colombo Stock Exchange. Okay, that's what I'm referring to. Now from the first one, let's go to the fourth difference. Customized contract. Now remember, we spoke about two people, one person wanting $200, other person wanting $1 million. Okay. The purposes are different. The volume is different. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly in multiples of hundreds. Okay. If the exporter might have $999,000 to change. But the quantum is different. Any amount. Okay. But depending on your requirement, your contract can be structured. And the rate that they give for both the parties is different. To a student who's approaching, it could be the standard rate. For a businessman who comes with a larger volume, they might give a better exchange rate. Okay, so there is customization between the customers that approach. But in an exchange traded market, we're talking about share market, you know, the share that you trade, you can even buy one share, you can buy two shares as long as it's a whole number. You can't buy 1.5 shares. That's not possible. The rule is according to the whole number you can buy. And if we are referring to something like a futures market, there are defined tenors of agreement. You can either enter into a 3-month agreement, 6-month agreement, 9-month. There is a defined package in terms of the period. You can't change it. But in the over-the-counter market, think about the exporter. He will say, look here, I will get $1 million in 2.5 months. Can you buy it at this price? But in an exchange traded market, no. It's already pre-packaged. It's already designed. You just have to choose it. They won't customize according to your need. Okay. Now we have the second and the third one. For the second one, whenever you approach any bank's, let's say this particular bank's website, see here, these are the indicative rates available for that. See, so these are the indicative rates that they have at the moment. Now, do we know the volume that is traded? We don't know the trade-wise information, we don't have. But we have an average on how the rate will be. According to the purpose, they have classified. All right. Now, let's go to our stock exchange. Okay. Okay. Now, if you approach this segment here, you can see on Friday, from the beginning till the end, how the trade has happened, at what time, what price, what quantity was sold. Now, do you see the difference there? Now, this is a real-time scenario. Now, see, at 11:59, 100 was exchanged at this particular timing, this particular price. All those information from the opening of the market to the end of market is available for you as a trader. Now, this is public information. Okay, you and I, anyone can access. If you are an investor who have specified access to the exchange, you will see something like this. Okay, now this I was able to get a screenshot. That's why it's on Paint. I can't get you the entire software. So here you can see each time a trade happens. Now for this particular share, this quantity was traded at this price. So it is 30 cents less than the previous trade. So this is the other trade that happened at the same time. So see, you can see so many, the real time you can get all these information appearing on your screen. Okay. So that's why we are telling you this is a big difference when it comes to the over-the-counter market and an exchange traded market. Then we have counterparty risk. Now, whenever you approach the bank, treasury, now the exporter, let's assume he wanted to convert his $1 million into rupees in 2.5 months. Okay, because his buyer is going to pay him back in 2.5 months. Let's say this agreement he made somewhere around end of February, 2.5 months. around May beginning, let's say, coronavirus time, lockdown everywhere, the buyer cannot pay. Then this exporter will have to cancel his agreement with the bank. So there is a counterparty risk that happens. Okay. But in exchange traded market, who is the middleman that you deal with? The exchange. Exchange acting as the clearing house. So essentially what happens is you have the exchange as the middleman. Here you have the buyer and the seller. Now there is no any direct contact. The buyer doesn't know who the seller is and the seller doesn't know who the buyer is. All right. He puts his order, his buying order to the exchange. He will put his sell order to the exchange. All right. Now, when he puts a buying order, what does this exchange do? Oops. What does this exchange do? This exchange will keep the money of the buyer on hold. Okay. He didn't still deduct the money from the buyer's account, but he will say, look here, you have placed an order, so I am going to block this much of money from your account. You don't necessarily need to have cash. On a margin trading basis, the broker can give you some loan, but think about the scenario where the exchange can hold or reserve the funds from the buyer. Same thing happens to the seller, but here what happens, he is selling, right? So when the seller puts his order, the exchange says, look here, you have 2,000 shares of whatever. Now let's say he's trying to sell a X company's shares. He has 2,000 shares of X company, but he's selling only 1,000. He will say, look here, if you're going to put an order for sell 1,000, so I'm going to block 1,000 out of your existing quantity because you have already put an order and that order is still valid. Until the order is valid, he will block that quantity so that the adherence, both the party is now bound to honor the trade because it's blocked in such a way that the counterparty cannot default. All right. Now, if you are not new to the market, you might not see. Now, this is how in the market, when they put their buying and the selling, this is how it will work. So, you have the particular share here. You will see what share we are talking about. Here you will see the share name. Here you can see all the buying orders. Okay. For 71 rupees, this much of quantity people are willing to buy. Okay. For this particular price, this much of quantity people are willing to sell. Okay. Now you don't know who is selling them. All right. All you know is the quantity. Exchange acting as the middleman. Okay. And let's say I look at this. I am an investor. In my screen, this appears. Okay. I already have this particular company's shares. Okay, let's say 1,000 shares. And I'll say, okay, there is a buying for this 71.5. I will sell it at that. So if I sell it at this particular price, automatically my trade will get affected. If there is a gap only, it will appear as this. Okay, just for you to visualize on how the trading happens. This is how the demand, the buying and the selling codes appear in our stock exchange. Now here you can't access this from the CSE website. Each investor has access to the platform given by their broker. So that particular broker can approach this. Okay. Have any doubts? Okay. So in that way, counterparty risk in an exchange traded market is mitigated. I hope you're clear with that. Okay. Then I also wanted to show this to you. This is how the main screen will look at. These are just some of the stocks that were appearing in the screen at that time. So if you're live trading, you will see the latest buying quantity, just for you to know and familiarize yourself with the stock market. We have a different chapter at it as well, where we'll go into that in detail. But just for you to visualize, for each stock, the latest buying quantity, the buying price, the selling price, and the selling quantity. The last trade happened at this price and this quantity, the change, high, low, volume, every detail. And this is real time. Look here. At the end of market closing, what was happening at the real time basis, it will get updated. I hope it's clear for you. Now we are going to look at financial markets based on the timing of delivery. Now here, when we are talking about timing of delivery, we are talking about the delivery of that particular financial instrument. Okay. Now, based on this basis, you can classify markets as cash market and derivative market. Now, cash market, which we also call as the spot market, is the market for immediate purchase and sale of an instrument. You can immediately buy or sell that instrument. So think about this particular scenario. If you put an order, buying order, and if your buying order gets executed, immediately that amount of shares will come into your account, your CDS account. Okay, on a real time basis, that instrument will get delivered to you. All right. What is the other type we are going to look at? The derivative market. Now, derivative market, the instrument here is going to get delivered at a future date. Okay, at a future date. But in this particular derivative market, how the derivative market is structured is a bit tricky. Okay, so first we'll have a read through of it, and let me explain it to you how that market is structured. Now, unlike above, some financial instruments are contracts. For some financial instruments are contracts that specify that the contract holder has the right to buy or sell the underlying asset at some future date at a specified price. Now, you'll be wondering, okay, now that itself is very much confusing here. Let me make it briefly and a bit more graphical for you. Now, what happens in a cash market? In a cash market, delivery is immediate. That instrument is immediately exchanged. In a derivative market, it's a bit different. How it works is, you have a contract. Okay, this is what you call this is the contract. Okay, someone is selling this contract and someone will buy this contract. Okay. Now, what does this contract tell you? This contract says, look here, in 3 months' time, you can buy X company's shares at 30 rupees. Okay. This is what the contract says. You can buy. You have the right to buy. Okay. So the selling party is selling to the buyer a contract which says this. Okay. Now the financial instrument on which this contract is based. Listen carefully. The financial instrument in which the contract is based is these shares. Now, does this instrument get transferred the same day that the contract is executed? No. The contract says, look here, this contract allows you to buy that particular shares in 3 months' time. At a future date, you are entitled to receive this instrument. Do you get me? That's how the derivative market is structured. Okay. Let's go to the note and see whether it made clear. Financial instruments are contracts that specify that the contract holder being the buyer. Okay. He is the contract holder. After he purchases, he becomes the contract holder. Has the right to buy or sell. Now, this contract can be a buy contract or a sell contract. In this particular example, I have used a buy contract. Okay. This contract holder has the right to buy this instrument in a future date at a specified price. Okay. That's how the derivative market is classified. If you go to the note, I have given you an example. Okay. Now remember this same format. Let me draw up on my example. So my example says, you buy a contract which gives you the right to buy 100 shares of Access Engineering PLC in 1 month at 30 rupees per share. Okay. So essentially, seller is there. Seller is selling a contract to you. You are here. You are the buyer. Okay. This is you. All right. Then what does this contract tells you? Right to buy Access Engineering shares. Now, when I write AEL, don't get confused. This is that particular stock ticker. So I'm abbreviating to that. Okay. AEL shares in 1 month at 30 rupees. Okay. So now let's say this was entered on, now this contract, this buying and selling, this contract, this particular contract happened on 18th November 2020. Okay, which means in 1 month is 18th December 2020. Okay, you have the right to buy. This right, remember, that's the keyword. Now 1 month ago you bought this contract which gave you the right to get this company's shares in 1 month at 30 rupees. All right. Now you come at this date, 18th December. Okay. And when you see that company's share price on that day, you will see, oh my God, I can buy it in the market for 24 rupees and 60 cents. As the buyer or as the contract holder, what will you do? Will you exercise this contract and buy it at 30, or will you go to the market and buy it at 24.6? Because you have the right, it's not an obligation. Listen to the keyword there, not an obligation. You have the right. Right means if you want, you can buy. If it's not attractive, you can ignore it. Because it is your right, you will say, look here, not worth it. I'm not going to exercise this. You have bought the contract, yes, but you're not exercising it. You will go to the market and buy it at a much lower price. Now think about the other scenario. On the 18th December, assume this was 44.60. Then it's your right to buy at 30 rupees. Now the seller is at an issue, but it's very much favorable for you. So you will go ahead and exercise this right. Okay, that's how this derivative market works. Now, depending on how lucrative this price is compared to the market price, this particular contract's price will get affected. Price of the derivative. Now, this contract is the derivative. Okay. Why am I saying that? Now, first example, real price is 24.6, but your derivative gives you to buy at 30 rupees. Is it attractive? No. Now, you don't have to arrive on the 18th to see this price. Okay. If you have monitored the company's share throughout, you will see, oh no, I don't think this in the market, the price will go higher than 30 for this contract to be attractive to you. Then the price paid for this contract, if this buyer is trying to sell it to somebody else, the price at which he can sell this contract will be very low because the attraction is very, very less. It depends on these underlying instruments, this specified price and the market price. Think about the other scenario. Second example, I said in the real market it's 44.6, but your contract gives you to buy at 30 rupees. Very, very lucrative for you. Nearly 15 rupees less than the market. So there will be so much of demand to buy this contract. Therefore, price of this derivative will be very much higher in the market. Okay. That's why in the note I have said price of such contracts. Price of such contracts derive their value from the value of the underlying asset. And that is why you call this instrument, this particular instrument, as derivative. This one's value is derived based on that underlying asset. I hope I'm clear to you. Okay, whenever a student hears the word derivative, they get so annoyed and confused. Understand, derivative will always have an underlying asset. The name itself says the value of this contract comes from another, is derived from another asset. Okay, it depends on that underlying asset's value, and that's why you call this a derivative instrument. Ideally, derivative instruments will get traded in derivative markets. Okay. Another point I want to highlight for you all is I have used this term at and by. I know it's a very subtle difference. You might not even notice it when you're going through the note, but highlight those two and maybe put an asterisk. Okay, just put a mark on it. I will explain it to you. Just write it on the side. Okay, depending on whether it's at or by, the type of the derivative will change. If it's at, it's a European option. It's a European option. If it's by, it's an American option. Okay. It looks so messy, right? Let's go to a brand new canvas. Now, what were the two terms? I said at and by. If it's at, essentially, you call it the European option. By, you call it an American option. Now, you'll be wondering, what is this at and by? Remember, the contract has an underlying asset, right to buy, access shares at 30 rupees. Let's say the contract mentions at end of 1 month, or let's say it says by 18th December 2020. Okay. Now, what is this difference is that here, let's say in the market, in the stock market, 20, 30, 40. Okay. Let's say this is the 18th November price, 30th November price, 18th December price. Okay, let's assume the day you got into this contract, price was 40. Okay. It has come down, hit 30. Now come down and hit 24. This is hypothetical. Okay. It's a hypothetical example I'm using. It has approached this price. Now, because this is a European option, which allows you to exercise it only at the end of the 1 month. So, whatever the scenario, you can't exercise it in between, which means you can't buy this share at 30 rupees at any of this timeline. you can only buy it on this date. Okay, that is the rule, or that's how the at market or the European option will work. Okay, in a buy market, let's assume the same scenario, 40, 30 and 20. Here you have the 18th November, 30th November, 18th December. It was at 40, hit 30, now close to 24. Okay. Now here they allow you by 18. So you don't have to wait till the end for you to exercise. No, you can. Now you have bought it on this date. Okay, this is the end date. You can exercise at any date in between. Just by the 18th November, you should have exercised it. So any day in between, you can exercise your right. So this gives you, the American option gives you more flexibility. So assume this person could have bought at a much more, when it's much more favorable, and sold it off at a sold it off much earlier. They don't have to wait till the end of time. Okay, the timing is by the maturity, by that end date, you can exercise at any given time. The flexibility is high. Okay, just put a note of it in that slide over here. Okay, now let's see the differences. You have cash market, which involves the immediate payment and delivery. Derivative market involves a future obligation for delivery and payment. Now you'll be wondering, why has she used obligation here? I am referring to the now the buyer gets right. Who has the obligation here? I'm talking about this person. This one is now obliged, or he has the obligation to deliver the asset and for the payment. Okay, you have to pay for it, and the delivery is obliged but at a future date. Cash markets are used for investment, whereas derivative markets are used for hedging, arbitrage, or speculation. Now remember, these three are very, very different. Okay, that's why I have given all three terms specifically for you. In a cash market, again, think about our example, the share market, immediate payment and delivery. You do it for your investment purposes. But in a derivative market, the reason why you approach a derivative market is, remember the word investment is a long-term investment that we are referring to. Okay. If it's for profit motive, you call it trading or speculation. So here, cash markets for investment. Your long-term investment is what you have to keep in mind. In a derivative market, you will enter the market for your hedging purpose, for you to make use of any arbitrage scenario, or for you to make use of any speculative circumstances. Now, these three we will talk in detail when we go to the derivative chapter. That's a very huge chapter with a lot of calculations and all. But just for you to get an idea on these three, I'll give you a smaller explanation. Hedging means you want to cover your risk. You want to reduce your risk. With that purpose, you come to the market. Think about that whole hedging scenario we had with the oil price. So hedging meaning you want to protect yourself from a future risk, and because of that you are entering into the market. Arbitrage is where you have price differences in the market, okay, and you as an investor or a trader, you want to make use of that price differences, that arbitrage opportunity, and because of that you're getting into the derivative market. Speculation is, the speculative purpose here is what you're referring to. You are willing to take a higher risk with a motive of getting a quick return or a quick gain. You are willing to accept a higher risk for a higher gain. That's how these three are very, very much different for you. Okay. Basically, how I can explain is, the same scenario, the buyer will have these three intentions when they're approaching the market. He might come to the derivative market thinking that in the stock market prices can be adverse. You might face a risk. So to cover the risk, you might approach the derivative market. Okay. Arbitrage is if the buyer comes to the derivative market with the intention saying, okay, I can get this particular share using a derivative to a much better price than what it's getting traded in the share market. To make use of that price difference, he's coming into the derivative market. Or the other is, you want to get, you're getting into the derivative market on a speculative purpose. You're saying I can buy this contract at this price, and because the underlying security will be so lucrative, the specified price is so lucrative, I can sell this contract at a higher price within that time. Or I can sell that underlying asset at a much better price than what I bought. You are willing to take that risk to get a quick return. Okay. That's how these three are different. The motive here is the important factor. And the third one is, holder of the instrument in a cash market is entitled to its return. It can be a dividend or a interest return. But in the derivative market, the holder of the contract does not have the instrument yet. Therefore, they don't have the entitlement for the return of that underlying asset. Again, think about our example. You have invested in the stock market. You have bought a company's share in the stock market. So, if you buy it today and tomorrow the company is declaring the dividend, then as a shareholder, you are entitled for that dividend. Okay. But in a derivative market, you have bought this contract that will let you to buy this share in 3 months only. Within that 3 months, if this particular company has issued a dividend, that dividend doesn't come to the derivative instrument holder. Okay. That's what you're referring to. I hope that section of that part of the lesson is clear to you. It's a bit of a tricky topic. I hope you all understood. Then we come to the last segment from the whole lecture. Which is financial markets based on origin of the market. Okay, now here we are talking about a very much broader sense. Here we'll be focusing on where the issuer is, where the issuing instrument is issued, and the currency of the instrument in which it is issued. Based on that, you are going to classify the markets. Okay. Let me close all this. So basically, using the origin of the market, I can divide the financial markets into internal and external. And within this internal market, I can further classify into domestic market and foreign market. First, we'll go through the note, and after that, let me quickly summarize you on how these three are different. Okay. So in an internal market, what we are looking at is how the country of the issuer is differing from the country of the security issuance. Okay. So our focus is on two things. Where is the issuer based and where is the instrument issued? That's what we are going to look at. So simply, in a domestic market, we are looking at the issuer and the issuance both happening in the same country. Okay. The issuer is also in the same country and the security that is issued is also issued in the same country. Come to the foreign market. Here, now here there is going to be a difference. Here, the issuer is in a different country, but the security is issued to a totally different country. The country between these two are going to be separate, not the same country. That's why you call it a foreign market. What happens in an external market? External market is also referred to as the international and the offshore market. Sometimes you call it the Euro market as well. External market is a market where securities with the following distinguishing features are traded. At issuance, the securities are offered simultaneously to investors in a number of countries. And now, because you're going to issue it in a number of countries, can you issue these securities to comply with only one of those countries' regulations? No. You have to issue the securities outside of any single country's jurisdiction. It's going to comply with international level. Okay. You can't issue a security which will only comply with one country's rules and regulations. You're going to issue in multiple countries. Okay. So your issuance is going to be outside the jurisdiction of any one country that you're going to issue. Now let me summarize this graphically for you. So if we are talking in a small grid scenario, okay, we are having three markets here. What are the three markets? We have the domestic market, foreign market, and the external market. That's what we are looking at. So here you have the domestic, the foreign, and the external market. So let's assume in all three we are talking about a Sri Lankan company. Okay, we are talking about a Sri Lankan based company. So this particular company is the issuer. All right. Now what are we going to look at? The country of issuance. Let's see, this particular company is issuing a bond. Okay, they are issuing a corporate bond. Where are they going to issue this corporate bond is the next question. So, issuance, country of issuance. So, in a domestic market, we are saying the Sri Lankan based company will issue this bond in the Sri Lankan market itself. Okay. And because they are issuing it in the Sri Lankan market, What is the currency that they will issue it in? Rupee. So this is the ideal scenario of a domestic market. What am I talking about when it comes to a foreign market? The issuer is in Sri Lanka, but they're issuing a bond, let's say, in Japan. And when you're issuing it in Japan, it has to be in what currency? In yen. Okay. So this is a foreign market. So ideally you call this the foreign bond. You must have heard this term samurai bond. This samurai bond refers to this. If it's a bond issued in Japan in yen by any company which is outside Japan, you call it the samurai bond. So here you're issuing it in Japan, issuing it in yen, but the issuer is not a Japanese entity. It's outside Japan. So ideally we are talking about a samurai bond here. Okay. See the difference. What are we talking about when it comes to an external market? Let me make it clear for you. Samurai bond. So what am I talking to when it's an external market? External market is Sri Lankan based company. Let's say they are issuing the instrument, they're issuing a bond, a euro bond. A euro bond meaning it doesn't have to be in euro. Okay, we're talking about a euro market. That's why you call it a euro bond. Here, let's say they want yen. That Sri Lankan company wants yen. But remember, now they are going to issue in multiple countries. Here they might issue it in Germany and UK or another number. So here all three are essentially different. Okay, issuer is in a different location, countries of issuance is completely different, and the currency in which you're raising is different to the currency that is used in these issuance countries. Okay, in a foreign market, only difference is the issuer is in a different location. But in a domestic market, all three will align in one place. All three meaning I'm referring to the currency as well. So that is basically how the markets are classified based on the origin of the market. All right. So with that, we are finishing off with the second lesson. Okay, we will go through this again in detail when we come to our bond market, because you most of the time you see it in the bond segment of it. You have domestic bonds, foreign bonds such as samurai bonds and euro bonds that gets traded. So to know the features of it, we will discuss this in that topic as well. So with that, we will close off our last week's lesson and start off for the new topic this week. So this week we are looking at fundamentals of financial markets. Now remember, our first three lessons are going to be very, very theoretical. Okay. So here we are all looking at more the fundamentals on a more theoretical aspects when it comes to the financial markets. So I'll try my best again to link to the practical scenario so you can see the theory being actually implemented in the actual world. Okay. So this was the summary that we have in our last lecture. So I have used the basis of classification here. Basis of classification is what I have given here. Okay. So based on this basis, how the type of markets are broken down into is what I have given on the other side. Again, remember the features and remember the example. If it's unable for you to remember the features, at least keep the examples in mind for you to come up with your own points at least. All right, but always use the key terms when it comes to each point. So today we are going to start off with one of the important variables when it comes to the financial market, which is the interest rate. We are going to see how this interest rate, why is this interest rate important to us? How is this interest rate calculated? And how is this interest rate derived on a theoretical base? Okay. So interest rate influences the borrowing and lending in our economy. If the interest rates are high, what happens? Borrowing becomes slow. Borrowing is relatively discouraged, but lenders are very much willing to lend to the market. Why? The lenders can charge a higher rate, but borrowers are at a disadvantage because they have to incur a higher cost. If the interest rates are low, what happens? Lenders are discouraged because the income that they get is very low, but the borrowers are encouraged to borrow because the cost is very low. So what is this interest rate? It is the return paid by a borrower to the lender, or simply you can call it the price paid for the use of funds. You are using someone else's funds for you to use that. That's a particular right that the lender has given it to you. For that right, you need to bear a certain cost or pay a certain price, and that price is called the interest rate. Interest rate is basically expressed as a percentage of your borrowed funds. So when you're calculating your cost, it depends on the borrowed amount. All right. So what is the significance when it comes to interest rate in the financial market? Interest rate is an important tool in the monetary policy through which economic variables such as savings and investment are influenced. Now, this is self-explanatory. You should be understanding it, but let me briefly explain it to you. Think about the current scenario where the interest rates are low. On a low interest rate regime, what happens essentially? Savings are discouraged and consumption is encouraged. On the other scenario, because consumption is increasing, meaning demand is increasing. So on the counter side, supply has to increase as well, ideally leading to higher investments. Okay, so interest rate becomes a very important tool to influence these two variables. If you want to increase savings, you will have to increase the interest rate. If you want to increase investment, you will have to reduce the investment rate. Why am I saying that? If the interest rate is low, companies are encouraged to borrow and invest. Okay, on that avenue, investments are encouraged. That's why you say interest rate is an important tool that is used to influence these two variables in the economy. Interest rate brings the supply of money or loanable funds into balance with the demand for money or loanable funds. For now, omit this word loanable funds. I will explain it to you when we come to the latter part of the lecture. So when we move to study the determination of interest rate, we are going to learn the loanable funds theory and the liquidity preference theory. There you will know this term called loanable funds. Okay. That essentially means the amount that is available for you to give out as loans. So interest rate, think about this, interest rate is the balancing or the balancing tool between the demand and supply for loanable funds. Okay, for you to bring it to an equilibrium position, interest rate is important. The other is interest rate helps to induce the savers to direct their savings into productive investments, which in turn promote economic growth. Now, this term productive investment ideally refers to investments that you make that will improve the output of the economy. Now, investment, when you use that word investment, it refers to a company putting up a factory, that is also an investment, or if the company buys a land, that is also an investment. But from an economy perspective, what is more productive to you? If that factory is going to manufacture new goods and going to put out to the market, that's going to increase the output in the market. Because it's a new factory, employment will increase. So that will essentially allow you to improve the economic growth in the country. But think about a company which has bought a land with no plan. Their motive is to buy the land and sell it at a profit. Okay. So you buy the land and you sell it at a higher price. Did any additional person get any employment? Did any good happen to the economy in terms of output? No. So those, even though both of these are investments, a productive investment is something that will improve the country's output and lead to economic growth. The other one that I refer to, investing in real estate with the intention of reselling at a higher price, it's also an investment, but it's what you call non-productive investment. That is just one example. You think about individuals buying luxury cars. Okay, they will import the luxury car and use that luxury car and ideally dispose of it. That's an investment for the individual, but on the other side, there is nothing essentially improving the country's growth. You're just increasing the imports of the country and giving more pressure to the exchange rate. Okay, so those what you call a non-productive investments. So why is this interest rate help? How does the interest rate help the saver to direct their funds towards those productive investment? Is that, imagine in a bank, they give you a higher interest rate. So as a saver, you and me, we are working for a salary. From that salary, after our expenses, we have something to save. So that particular amount, when the interest rates are high, we are motivated to deposit in the banking system. So the banking system could ideally use to direct those savings into productive investments. Think about a low interest rate scenario where the interest rates are so low and you are discouraged to hold as savings. Then you will invest in non-productive investments which will give you higher return, but you are unable to improve the economic growth of the country. All right. The other is interest rate influences individual and cooperative financing decisions. That is again simple, and I know you can understand. On an individual basis or even on a company perspective, whether you're going to finance your investment, finance your consumption based on a loan or your own funds, essentially equity, depends on the interest rate. When the interest rates are low, as a borrower, you are encouraged to borrow and meet your requirements, investments or consumption. So interest rate is essentially what impacts your financing decision. Even the interest rates, let's say, is 15-16%, will you borrow and consume, or you will borrow and consume only a limited quantity? Okay, but assume the interest rate is now around 6 to 5%, you might consume much more on borrowing. Okay, so that influences your financing decision making. Lastly, we have interest rates affecting the value. Value meaning we are talking about the price of the security traded in the money and capital market. Now, how this happens is, I have an equation over here just for you to understand how it happens. Here you see the term I here. I don't know whether the pointer will work here. No, not working. But let's keep it as it is. The I over here at the denominator, what I'm referring to over here, this is the interest rate. So the interest rate always has an inverse relationship when it comes to the price. So now this is the equation for you to find out the price of a security or a bond. So when the interest rate increases, price of the security will decrease. When interest rate decreases, price of the security increases. Okay, so interest rate plays a significant role on valuing your security or your bond investments. Again, this equation, for now, it's only an image for you. In about after 2 lessons, your entire life is going to be dependent on this formula. Just a small introductory trailer for you to look at the formula. Again, we will go through in detail and you will understand why we are dividing by that. For now, think of a more mathematical perspective. Understand that interest rate is inversely related to a price of a security. If the interest rate is high, price of the security will be low. If the interest rate is low, price of the security will be high. That's why here we are mentioning that interest rate directly affects the price of the security that are traded. It's a direct impact that it has on the price of the financial instruments traded. Next, we are going to look at these two terms that we come across in the market: the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate. The nominal interest rate is the interest rate quoted by financial institution. In other words, it is the rate that is before or not adjusting for any inflationary impact. Basically, if you go to the market and if institution says this is your interest rate, that will be your nominal interest rate. Let's say when you go to the market, they say 10% is your interest rate for this loan. That is the nominal interest rate. Okay. Real interest rate is the interest rate that is adjusted for inflation. Ideally, this real interest rate will reflect the real cost of the interest payment. Now, how these two differ? What is the difference between a nominal and the real interest rate is the inflation. Nominal interest rate is not adjusted for inflation, but real interest rate is after you adjust for inflationary impact. Ideally, the real interest rate will tell you the real cost of your interest payment or your interest income. Now, Fisher has developed an equation to match these three variables, the nominal, the real interest rate, and the inflation rate. And this is the equation for that. Okay. 1 plus nominal interest rate is equal to 1 plus real interest rate multiplied into 1 plus inflation rate. So I have a question here for you. A bank provides a loan of 1 million for 1 year at the rate of 13.3. Now this 13.3, you know, is this the real or the nominal? Bank provides. So that is the nominal interest rate. If the expected inflation rate over the year is 10%, what is the interest, what is the real interest rate? It has been duplicated here. What is the real interest rate earned by the bank? Okay. So we are going to use Fisher's equation here. You have 1 plus nominal interest rate is equal to 1 plus real interest rate into 1 plus inflation rate. So you have your nominal interest rate 13.3. 13.3. Real interest rate is your unknown variable. Inflation rate, you already know, 10%. So you have to interchange this variable onto the counter side, and then you arrive at your answer where real interest rate is 3%. Now, if you come across this kind of a question at a MCQ, or if you want to cross-check your answer at any given time, or for you to quickly get the approximate answer, you can use this formula. But remember that formula, this particular formula that I've highlighted below, let me use a different color to it. This particular formula is only a formula for approximation. It won't get you the actual answer, but you will get an approximate figure to the real answer. So what does that say? Nominal interest rate is essentially the sum of real interest rate plus inflation rate. So 13.3 meaning it's the real interest rate plus the inflation rate of 10%. So you get your real interest rate at 13.3, which will approximate to the above in detail calculation. Now this is important. This formula, this approximate formula is important. Why? Because this approximate formula which will actually allow you to understand the relationship between the nominal and the real interest rate. So here you can see nominal includes the inflation. You have not adjusted for it. But the real interest rate does not have the inflationary impact. Only if you add on to the inflation, add the inflation to the real interest rate, you will arrive at the nominal interest rate. How I can explain this to you is think about an ideal pensioner scenario. You have your grandfather or grandmother who has a certain amount of money in the bank, and let's say in January the interest income she got out of the fixed deposit is 10,000. Okay. In February also she gets 10,000. Now January, when she takes the 10,000, goes to the market, she is only able to buy, let's assume 5 kilos of rice. Hypothetical. Okay. 5 kilos of rice. But in February, when you go, she can only get 4 kilos of rice. So that's where the inflation impact essentially comes. The real cost or the real power, purchasing power behind that income will be affected by the inflationary pressure. Okay. Then we move to the calculation of interest. Interest rates are most commonly calculated on a simple interest basis. Simple interest basis meaning you use your principal amount that you have deposited, and based on that, the interest gets calculated. Now, compound interest is a interest on interest scenario, which means here you calculate your interest for a given period based on the principal, and if there is any accumulated interest from the previous period. So essentially you have simple interest and compound interest. Let's say you have different timelines. It's a let's say it's for 3 months. Okay. So in the first scenario, your simple interest is based on the principal. Here also, in the compound interest, it will be based on principal. Now, this is I'm talking to you when you make the initial deposit. Okay. Why is this principal only? Because it's the initial investment. There is no any accrued interest for you. Okay. So, there is no accrued interest, just the principal. When you go to the second scenario, here again, the second period. Now, this is the first period interest. Here, the second period's interest is also based on principal. But when you come to the compound interest, what happens? You have principal plus interest applicable for the period 1. You will use this as the basis and multiply and get your interest. Okay. Again, when you come to the third period, here basis is again principal, but in a compound interest scenario, this is the divider. Okay. In this scenario, what happens? Principal plus all accrued interest. Okay. So you have interest for period 1 and interest for period 2, and then you will calculate your interest for period 3. This is the basis that you will actually use. This is the difference on how you calculate the interest for simple interest and compound interest. Remember, the very first period, the basis is the same, but thereafter the basis becomes to differ. Which will have a higher interest? Obviously the compound interest. Why? Even for the previous interest, you get a interest. Okay. On the interest for period 1, your interest for period 2 is calculated. If you come to this scenario, interest for period 3 is calculated using interest of period 1 and period 2. Okay. So I have given you the formula here. instead of going into detailed calculation, you can use this to find the compound interest for any given payment frequency. All right. Very rarely you get an MCQ out of this, but just for your knowledge purpose, know the formula. Now we move to determination of interest rate. So how is this interest rate actually arrived at in the market? I hope you all have done economics. If you have done economics, an easier way for me to explain this to you is just like how a price for a good is determined, where you have supply and demand deciding the price for that good. Here we are going to see how is the interest rate determined in the market. Okay. So similar to price determination, interest rate is also determined by demand and supply. So here you have demand and you have supply. Okay. In the goods market, in the product market, we are talking about price here. Okay. But now financial market, we are looking at interest here. Remember, one of the significance of interest is the balancing between demand and supply. We saw that in the previous slide. So now we are going to study that. Now there are two theories. Okay. Two theories which says what this demand is and what this supply is. Okay. That's basically the difference. Here on the first one, you have theory of loanable funds, theory of loanable funds, and the second one is the liquidity preference theory. In each theory, they say, look here, demand is for this particular item, supply is for this particular item. Again, here it says no, demand is for this, supply is for this, and again these will essentially determine the interest rate. So we will look at what this demand and supply is based on. So there are two theories explain how the interest rate in an economy is determined. You have the loanable funds theory and the liquidity preference theory. So first we are going to look at the loanable funds theory. It's introduced by the Swedish economist Knud Wicksell. He came out with this new term called the loanable funds. Just like what the term says, it refers to the amount of money that is available to give out as loans. So for you to know a definition perspective, it is the sum of money supplied to lend and demanded to invest during a given period. Now, don't get confused with this. Money supplied with the intention to lend. Okay. And here, money that is demanded with the intention to invest is what they are referring to. So essentially, think about the amount of money that is available to give out as loans. That is the main focus point in this theory. Okay. So the demand and the supply depends on the demand for the funds, loanable funds, and supply depends on the supply of loanable funds. Now, who is supplying the loanable funds? Someone has to give money for the banks to give the loans, right? Who is the person giving that money to the bank so that they can give loans? Essentially the saving unit. Remember the surplus unit? So the surplus unit will give the money to the banking system with the intention that they can use it for lending purpose. So who are these people who are demanding money to invest? The borrowers with the intention of investment. Okay. So savings is the source of supply of loanable funds. Investment is the source of demand for loanable funds. And these two will determine the equilibrium interest rate. Equilibrium, as per the loanable funds theory, what does it say? Equilibrium interest rate in the market depends on the supply and demand of loanable funds available in an economy. So if you are going to this diagram, we are talking about demand of loanable funds, supply of loanable funds. So here loanable funds. Here also we are going to look at loanable funds. So for the demand of loanable funds, what is the source? Investment. For supply of loanable funds, what is the source? Comes from savings. So when these two reach the equilibrium, you call it the equilibrium interest rate. Now let's see how this demand, in what ways does this demand comes and in what ways does this savings come? How can this saving and demand, supply and demand can get influenced? Okay, see this demand for loanable funds. You know the participants in our economy. It will come from any of these parties. So from a household, the demand for loanable funds will come through consumption. To consume, you might use for your, you might request for loan, credit cards, those sense. Okay. On a company perspective, demand for loanable funds will mainly come from investment needs. For a government, why do they need borrowings? When you have a budget deficit, when their income is lesser than their expense, to meet the expenses, they might have to borrow. So again, demand for loanable funds can come through the government during a budget deficit. Now let's go to the other two. Decrease in money stock. Money stock meaning if the amount of money available in the economy is reduced. What happens? The amount of money is reduced, meaning the amount that gets circulated will also get impacted. Then can you demand more? No, your demand will also get impacted. Okay. Other one is increase in demand for money. So essentially increase in demand for money. Remember, demand for money can happen through three reasons: transaction, speculative need, for any precautionary purpose. So those three purposes is what we are talking about. Whenever there is a decrease in the demand for money, again, so increase in demand for money, the demand for loanable funds will get impacted. Now we are looking at supply of loanable funds. Who is supplying the loanable funds? In what ways can it come? When the households have high savings, that will increase the supply of loanable funds. When the companies have any undistributed profits, retained earnings for such sense, so that is also can be used towards savings ideally. Okay, so that will also affect the supply of loanable funds. For a government, when they have budget surplus, when their income is higher than their expenses, the higher income can be invested. They can save it somewhere. Okay, so that is also a way of influencing the supply of loanable funds. Other two are increase in money stock. If the amount of money available in the market is high, that means the supply of loanable funds available will also be affected. There will be more money that gets circulated in the market. The other is decrease in demand for money. So if the people or the households are not demanding for money, they don't want to hold more money, meaning that means they will save more, and that will essentially impact the supply of loanable funds. So these 5 are the ways in which the demand and the supply for loanable funds can get influenced. Okay, the sources of how that supply or the demand arises. Okay, demand for loanable funds is downward sloping. Why? Higher interest rate makes borrowing more costly. Therefore, quantity of loanable funds demanded will drop. Now, demand meaning you want the money to consume, you want the money for investment. If you have a high interest rate, the amount that you demand, this is the amount that you demand, okay? That amount of demand is less. But here, look at here, if the interest rate is low, the demand increases. Essentially, think about the current scenario when the interest rate is low. So many people are approaching banks for loans. Okay, but the other opposite happens for a supply. When the interest rate is high, people are very much encouraged to save. So ideally, this scenario we are talking about. So high interest rate meaning you are willing to supply more money. You're willing to keep more of your money as savings. But when the interest rate is very low, no point for you to keep as savings. You can rather spend it in the economy. Okay. So when the interest rate is low, in this scenario, you can see savings has dropped. So supply for loanable funds is upward sloping and demand for loanable funds is downward sloping. Higher interest rate makes savings more attractive, but higher interest rate makes borrowing more disadvantageous because it's more costly. Okay. So here you can see supply of loans, which is ideally the savings. D refers to the demand for loans, which is investment. So equilibrium interest rate are all what we are referring to, that is here. This one. This particular one is what I'm referring to. It is the interest rate at which the quantity of loanable funds supplied matches with the quantity of loanable funds demanded. Now, if the interest rate in the market is above this equilibrium rate, let me zoom it in for you. Okay. Now, let's assume your interest rate is here. Okay. So in this scenario, interest rate is high. Interest rate is high. Demand is at this particular position. supply is at this particular position. Demand is here, supply is here. Okay. So you can see when high interest rate, people are demanding a lesser quantity, but savers are willing to give more quantity. So ideally, this scenario is a excess situation. Quantity of loanable funds supplied is larger than the quantity demanded by firms. Banks will have to now lower their interest rate to attract more borrowings. So when they lower the interest rate, what happens? You can see borrowings will start to increase and come up to this position. Okay, for you to increase the borrowing, you will have to decrease the rate a bit for you to arrive at that equilibrium level. If not, if the market rate is higher than equilibrium rate, it leads to a excess position in the market. So ideally, you get into a high market liquidity. There's a lot liquidity in the market is at a very high level. There's so much of money available to lend, but the demand is very low. A surplus in the market, essentially. Okay. Now let's go to the other scenario when the interest rate is lower than the equilibrium rate. So you are at this position. Okay. So here, this is your supply. Okay, this is the supply curve, and this is your demand curve. So when the interest rate is low, people want more loans, demand is very, very high, but people are not willing to hold money in savings because their interest income is very, very low. Then what happens? Banks will have to now increase their interest rate so that savings are encouraged and the borrowings are somewhat discouraged. So they can come to a equilibrium position. Now, what is this difference? Sorry. What is this difference? It is the deficit in the market. Why am I calling it a deficit? Because supply is very, very low, but the demand is very, very high. So there is a gap in the market. There is a demand in the market that is unfulfilled. So there is a gap, a deficit in the market. Then you have a low liquidity or a liquidity issue in the market. The fund available for you to give out as loan is very, very low. So we are talking about that kind of a scenario. All right. Then we will start off with the new topic, liquidity preference, but I think we are closer to finishing our lesson. So we'll start off our next lesson from this point because it will go on for a time being. If you have time, refer the slides. So our next class will start off from this particular point. With that, we'll wind off today's lesson. So this will be the last lesson for the year. Next week, you will be at peace. You can enjoy your Saturday at home. And we will meet again in the new year, hoping that 2021 will have your exams on time, no any delays in it. Okay. And we will meet again on the 2nd of January then. All right. If you, in your spare time, go through the notes, study again. I know for this entire year, you all didn't have exams. It's actually a time that you all have lost, but in the next exam, try to do your best and finish off all these commitments as early as possible. Okay, so we'll have a good season. If you're celebrating Christmas, have a good Christmas and a happy new year to all of you, and we'll meet again on the 2nd of January. Thank you so much for listening. I hope y'all are all clear with what we spoke today. If you have any doubts, let me know. All right, thank you so much.